you know how that goes. Eventually, this included labels, merchandising, brewer biographies, really anything that could help me tell the story. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera at this point. This is a highly visual presentation, and hopefully by turning mine off, it'll encourage you to go ahead and minimize that screen, because I really designed this presentation to fill the entire screen, only learning yesterday that this little window would pop up. So I'm going to go ahead and turn mine off right now. All right, before we begin, I'd like to show you a few interesting ads that I found and stored from other industries.
Michael, looks like you're not shared. Your screen isn't shared.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see.
There we go.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, before we start, I'm going to show you some ads that I found and restored from other industries. In the future, I'd like to dedicate an hour to the many more of the hundreds of ads that I've located. Really an interesting subject matter. Some of these ads have interesting engravings, like this Eureka Foundry Company, that really show the size of these operations. Eureka, in particular, really the entire Humboldt Bay area, and then later on in the Redwood Belt, tons of huge factories were here at one time, and it's really surprising. These ads really illustrate that really well. Others can be used as visual aids when discussing historical events or forgotten industries. I don't have a lot of time to talk about these. I have a lot to get through today, but people that are familiar with Eureka history will recognize these names. Shipbuilding was huge here, wartime industry, steamships, and then who doesn't need sick headache powder, a local product from Dr. Wells. Forgotten places such as South Park and racetrack, in this case, that extended all the way from 14th Street eventually to Hawthorne. So quite a large track, and a number of other businesses were named South Park as well. Theaters, again, interesting illustrations that can show the scope of some of the buildings. This was a building that was built originally, a three-story wooden building, burned in 1876, was almost immediately rebuilt as a single-story building with the intention of adding a second story. That didn't happen during Monroe's lifetime, the original owner, but Jackson built that in 1912. This is now the Booklegger. Looks quite a bit different than it does today at 2nd and E. Really, any interesting imagery appealed to me, and again, helps to tell the story of what life might have been like at once in the 19th and earliest 20th centuries. This presentation is a work in progress. As you'll see, I have a lot of information, and creating these slides has been far more time consuming than I anticipated. I wasn't able to cite my sources in the presentation for each image, so I'd like to spend a minute on the topic now. Newspapers, of course, incredibly useful. The Humboldt Times has been digitized from 1874 to 1923 or 4. And that was a huge amount of information that I got from that. But all of these newspapers contributed to this presentation one way or another. City directories are also very useful. Magazines, libraries, museums, and historical societies. County clerk's office for deeds, voter registers gave a lot of the same type of information. Bill Ziegler's 1909 Humboldt Brewing Company photos as printed in the Historian, Humboldt Historian in 1982. And Irvine's history of Humboldt County gave me a lot of information about a particular brewer biography. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. Susie Baker fountain papers for non-digitized newspaper articles and ads. Alan Mauer's 1969 HSU history paper on the history of brewing in Humboldt County, provided dates and articles. Glenn Nash's 1992 historian article gave me some great brewer names. Jack Nash, no relation, for allowing me to document his merchandise. Renee Chappelle helped me locate one of the breweries and clued me into the usefulness of the deeds at the Register County Clerk's office. And finally, Chuck Petty for giving me a great illustrative photo. And I'm going to be talking about all of these as we go on. The Humboldt Brewery name and imagery has lasted through numerous iterations. Here we see three distinct eras using the same base image. On the left is from the late 1900s and 1910s, the Humboldt Brewing Company. The 1930s are represented in the middle, Humboldt Malton Brewing Company, and the 1990s on the right with the Humboldt Brewing Company in Arcata. My first presentation of this material was in the summer 2019 edition of the Humboldt Historian. I organized that article by brand, but as I've learned since with the digitization of the Humboldt Times and other resources, it makes more sense to follow the breweries themselves, the physical building. So that's what we're going to be doing today. A few interesting facts emerged while I was researching regional and national trends, just as background information. Many of the mid-19th century brewers were from Germany. They were escaping political unrest in Germany at the time, and a great number of them ended up coming to the US and becoming brewers. Breweries were often among the first businesses established in new towns. This was really true going back to the 1600s, but especially on the West Coast. And the first issue of many newspapers contained ads for breweries. This being the case, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that Humboldt Bay had a brewery prior to the fall of 1854. I don't know, but I think it's possible. And on a final note, before I show our first slide in full, I'm hoping for additional information to emerge from this presentation. I've used bold typeface for relevant names and hope that relatives may see this and tell me more about their ancestors. So the one way that this presentation in the future will become more expansive is through feedback from people that see this presentation now or when it's on YouTube. So our first brewery that we know of anyway is the Humboldt Brewery, opened in 1854, September 23rd, by recently appointed Justice of the Peace Daniel Gilbert. As you can see, it was located on 2nd between E and F, and I haven't taken the time to diagram all the breweries, but some of these early breweries that there are no photos for and scarce information, it helped me to figure out where they were so that I could go find other information, as you'll see. I'm going to slaughter a lot of names today, I'm sure. Brewer Pequet Marhoffer produced a porter, an ale, and a lager. During background information, I found some information that said that Boca beer from Boca, California, which is near Truckee, was the first lager brewed in California in 1874. This is clearly not the case, although Eureka was not the first place that this happened either. San Francisco's Eagle Brewery, there was breweries in Sacramento and other places already that were producing lagers, but I just thought that was interesting. It was far earlier than they had claimed. The Humboldt Brewery beer was available in bottles. This is really unique at the time. In fact, some 80% of breweries gave their beer or sold their beer only in kegs. It wasn't until Prohibition when soft drink makers really perfected bottling that a lot of breweries started bottling. So it's a rare to have a brewery here, although I believe this brewery was actually very short-lived. In fact, all I really know is that Gilbert left the county in the summer of 1858. I don't know how long the brewery had actually been operating. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that in a small town, especially a town like Eureka, which we'll talk about in a little while, had a lot of brewery or a lot of saloons, I mean, that it may not have been necessary to advertise. They may have been able to just sell. They're not talking enormous amounts, maybe a few hundred barrels a year for most of these breweries. So they may not have needed to advertise. And with these early breweries, that's where most of this information comes from. So unfortunately, the first part of this presentation, I'm going to have to say a lot, and that's all I know. Nothing further is known. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to learn more about all of these breweries. So this is the location, if you hadn't already figured that out, for those of you that are local. So it's where the western half of the gazebo is today. And I don't know that it took this entire lot. I just know that that's the size of the lot that Gilbert purchased. And like many of the breweries during the 19th century, this was probably a single story building, not necessarily a substantial building. Next was the Union Brewery, started by Prussia-born Gustav Stanislawski. And this was located on F Street, south of 8th. The brewery opened in January of 1857. This was next to his family's laundry, tonsorial parlors, and baths. So he had kind of everything going on there, and we were just about a block and a half from the plaza. Now, Stanislawski and family arrived in Union with the Jacoby family in 1852 and lived in the hotel owned by the Jacobys for about 2 years. I thought I had more for that. He says that he employed an experienced brewer to produce lager and ale. Again, we see that lager showing up. It was almost immediately leased to Thomas Woolweber. And then just over a year later to Hiram Wood & Company. And then finally, a year or so later, to Bavaria-born John P. Wagner, and rebranded the Eureka Brewery and Distillery. And you see this ad on the right here. He was producing bourbon and brandy as well. Advertising continued through 1861. I don't know what happened after that. I believe that the brewing equipment was sold to a man named Charles Huck that we'll talk about in a minute, that brought it to Eureka for a brewery, but I'm not positive. There's just some information about that undated. And the brewhouse itself was demolished in 1897. The family's home that was also on the site burned in 1922. This is my best guess as to where this brewery is located. I haven't been able to get back to the county clerk's office in quite some time. And that's one thing that I want to look for when I'm there. But I believe that it's definitely within this yellow circle or square, but I believe the most likely location is the smaller square. And this is useful because it can help in locating if photos from this area are found. They might be able to pinpoint exactly where this brewery is. Next came the Eureka Distillery, Brewery and Distillery, John Wagner again. Was operating by August 1865. As you can see in this ad, he says that he's enlarged his establishment at that time. I don't really know if that's really when the brewery opened or not, but it was certainly in operation by August of 1865. Again, this brewery is the one that I don't really know where it is, even a little bit, other than there's some indication that there may have been a brewery on F, and at that time, Eureka really only extended to about 4th Street, so this would have been somewhere north of 4th. This brew house burned to the ground in April 1866. And shortly after, Wagner purchased Stanislawski's brewhouse in Arcata, but I'm not able to find any information that he brewed there. And as I said, I believe the brewing equipment had already been sold to Charles Huck. And when the brewery burned, the article says that he was able to save, in addition to furniture and clothing, a quantity of beer. So he had his priorities straight. Next came Way & Company's Humboldt Brewery. This may have been the next time that the Humboldt Brewing name showed up. I don't know that there's any direct relation to Gilbert's Humboldt Brewery, other than the inspiration of the name. And I tend to wonder on a lot of these early breweries if recipes were actually being shared or whether it was just a name that was being sold, maybe a location, but that they all would have just been making a lager, a porter, and they may not have been specific recipes. I'm really not sure about that. If anybody else out there knows, let me know at the end. This brewery was located at 2nd D Street. I don't know exactly where, but it was opened by the summer of August 1865. In October 1867, Huck and Jacob Marhoffer acquired the brand and brew house. We're going to talk more about both of these guys as the presentation goes on. The partnership ended the following April with Huck retaining the brand. And I don't see much about this until August 1873 with Thomas Winger Jr. and Joseph Edward Marhoffer, brother of Jacob, purchased the brand and expanded their offerings to include an ale and a porter. I was pretty excited to find this ad very recently because it was the first thing that I actually had that showed the second and D location, but again, it doesn't show which corner, so I can't nail that down just yet. And a lot of times these breweries, if the land wasn't sold and it was just a lease, that's much more difficult to find because it's not going to be in the clerk's records under deeds anyway. There's probably some way to find that, but I haven't gotten that, possibly tax records. Okay, next came Huck's Second and C Streets Brewery. This is not the brewery. This is the building that came after the brewery. But I know so little about this brewery and I had absolutely no visual information about it that I wanted to show something. And this was a substantial building that also no longer exists at the corner of Second and C Streets. Huck built this following the dissolution of his partnership in May 1868 with Marhoffer. And it was one of the first of 3 breweries that he constructed in Eureka. Again, I don't know really much about this brewery other than that it was a brewery and it's referenced as such. And contractors Foster and Mallory purchased this lot in 1887 for the construction of the Hotel Grand that opened in 1889. This building was also called I think it actually opened as the Grand Hotel, then it was the Hotel Grand, New Grand, and finally the Sterling. It looked exactly like this when it was torn down in 1949. Sad. Now Mindenhall Studios, a cinder block series of buildings, occupies the site. Next came Lynn's Summer and Grant Street Brewery. Again, a lot of these names are just names that I'm referencing. They didn't necessarily have an official name other than the Humboldt Brewery, the Eureka Brewery, things like that. A lot of these are just name holders that I'm using. Jacob Lynn ultimately purchased 3 lots in this vicinity. The one that you see here, right below the word Summer Street, and then the one next to it to the left. The first lot he bought, he had already built the brewery before he bought the second, so I'm almost positive it must have been this lot. And you can see where I think the brewery itself was on the inner square. I'm not positive, and I don't know that this building that is taken in, I think, in December of 1946, that I don't know that this was the building, but it very well may have been. That building is no longer there. In fact, a lot of this looks quite different. It was opened by late 1870, September of 1870, and the Northern Independent newspaper gave Lynn's beer a positive review. I mentioned that because that was one of the other things that came up in my research on national and regional trends, was that they said that that was a common thing for breweries to give a keg of beer to the newspapermen, and they often got a glowing review as a result. And in January 1874, the first 2 lots inside the larger square were offered in Sheriffsdale, and I don't know anything about it beyond that, unfortunately. There was reference in another brewing history that a firm named Davis and Simmons may have bought it, but I don't know whether they were conducting a brewery or not. I haven't found any more information about this. Next came the Humboldt Brewery at 5th and A Streets, opened in 1873. I don't know that this is the building, but this would be the building that came afterwards. Again, being so early, there's just no photographic information. I only had so many ads to use. This was the second brewery built by Charles Huck, and he purchased the lot in December of 1872 and immediately built the brewery. These breweries didn't usually take very long, so I imagine at some point within the first few months of 1873, the brewery would have been open. In August, he sold the brewery to his former partner, Joseph Edward Marhoffer and John Winger Jr. And as we saw in that earlier slide about the second and D, that firm may have been using that brewery for a few months before they moved over here. So I think they actually operated both breweries, but only very briefly. In May 1876, when Crescent City's James Harper purchased Winger's share, the brewery was producing just under 400 barrels a year. And that actually was fairly common. That was a pretty average number for smaller breweries at that time. There were, I want to say 4,000 something breweries in 1873. So this was just after the peak. And a lot of them were in that just a few hundred barrel a year range. Harper and Marhoffer were also partners with A.J. Monroe and the Humboldt Soda Works at 5th and B Streets. If you look at the ad on the right, the top says 5th and A, and the bottom says 5th and B. That's just because they were using their offices for the Soda Works as their mailing address and business offices for the brewery as well. In November 1878, the partnership ended with James Harper retaining the business, and then the brewery was offered for sale in January 1882. I don't find any information besides that. It's worth noting, though, that Eureka had, by this point, 2 daily newspapers, the Humboldt Standard and the Humboldt Times, as well as some weeklies at various points during this early history. So sometimes as many as 3 newspapers. And there's definitely precedence to say that if somebody was advertising in one, they wouldn't necessarily advertise in the other. I think that's because a lot of people were receiving both newspapers, so there wasn't the need to put it in both. And same with articles and important stories. I found times when a very important article shows up in one and not the other the same day. So there could be a lot of information in the Humboldt Standard that I'm not finding as well. So I'll take a slight break and talk about the brewing Marhoffers of Josephine, Humboldt, and Del Norte counties. Joseph and Elizabeth immigrated to North America from Germany and resided in Cincinnati for a little while before coming to Crescent City around 1856. The 1860 census shows that Jacob, Joseph, Edward, George, and Charles were the sons of Joseph and Elizabeth. And I believe that Joseph Edward's first and middle names were inverted in the census records. This was pretty confusing. I've seen references to Joseph E., Ed, Edward. There was all kinds of different variations, and it became kind of confusing. So I wanted to make that clear for future researchers that I think that there's just a mistake. He was a partner in the Western Brewery in Cincinnati from 1855 to 6, and the Marhoffer and Randall Sands Brewery in Waldo, Oregon, which is now a ghost town, from 1858 to the 1870s. And from 1874 to 88, he was the active owner in the Marhoffer Brewery in Crescent City. I say active because he was actually working the brewery. He still owned it when his son George operated it until an injury in 1890. Joseph and Jacob's Edward's son were both partners in the Humboldt Brewery, as I mentioned, but at different times. We talked about this. Joseph, his brother Charles, their brother Charles was also involved in either the 2nd D or 5th and A breweries. I know this because there was an article that talked about him severely damaging his foot when he got it caught in some machinery. And I have a Chuck Petty photo that we're going to look at later that will show how that might have happened. Sadly, between February 1890 and June 1891, the Marhoffer family lost Joseph Edward, Charles, Joseph, George's 2-year-old son, and George, respectively, all in separate events on separate occasions. 5 people in the same family within less than 2 years, a year and a half, actually. And during a visit to Eureka in September of 1903, Jacob discussed once owning the brewery at 5th and A. He's not listed on any deeds, advertising, or anything I found so far, so he may have been a silent partner. Again, a lot of the ownership history of these breweries is a little convoluted and took a bit of sorting out. So this is Jacob sitting. He outlived his brothers by 45 years. His son sitting behind him, his name is Joseph as well, and he was a lighthouse keeper for a long time at St. George Reef Lighthouse. When Jacob died in 1935, he had lived in Crescent City longer than any other resident at that time. Next came the short-lived and virtually non-existent information, the Ronerville Brewery. In December 1875, the Feigenbaum brothers purchased the lot. It, I assume, opened sometime the next year, and it was offered for sale in July 1877 as the Ronerville Brewery. So I know it had opened at one point, but beyond that, I don't know what happened to this brewery. Again, anybody out there knows any information about this, particularly people that are researching the Eel River Valley, I'd really appreciate any information about these. Next came the Eureka Brewery in 1876. Charles Huck again, third brewery, purchased 1/3 interest in the property from Lawrence McNally in 1876, and he converted an existing dwelling into the brewery. Huck purchased, they actually were partners in both lots, the lot that Lawrence McNally's saloon was on and the brewery next to it, and they sold their shares in the each half to the other, so that by 1878, Huck owned the entire brewery half of that property. And then he sold half of it to Ireland-born Patrick McAleenan in January 1879. McAleenan tried unsuccessfully to sell it less than 18 months later. These breweries went fast. They were constantly changing ownership. It's an 1890 city directory ad for the brewery. A fire in May 1881 was quickly controlled with only minor damage. That's unusual. They usually burn to the ground. Patrick McAleenan purchased Huck shares on December 1st, 1882, and became the sole proprietor. He remodeled the brewery and installed a 38-barrel copper kettle in 1884. That seems very large to me at the time for a relatively small brewery. No sour beer, promised the Eureka Brewery in 1885 in the city directory. We know now that I think they're talking about something altogether different than our modern sours. On April 2nd, 1886, a U.S. Deputy Marshal seized the brewery on charges of utilizing canceled stamps. These barrels were stamped as a way of making sure that the taxes were paid, and I guess it was a pretty common problem for people to reuse stamps and therefore avoid paying the tax on all of their stock. And in fact, after Prohibition, that was one of the things that they tried to avoid by separating distribution from production and sales. And all charges were dropped 6 weeks later. When I first saw this, I thought, well, how terrible that he would be out of business, but it actually allowed somebody to continue running the brewery for him. So I don't know how much it actually damaged his business at the time. And we're going to continue with that story. It's the one time here where I'm going to break this in half because it goes so far forward that I don't want to have to jump back too far to talk about the remaining breweries. This is the Ferndale Brewery, came next in 1885. And July 25th, R.M. Brown announced that he had opened a brewery on Ocean Avenue. He had previously run a store at Roberts Hall, which I've learned is Portuguese Hall now. And he ran it out of the rear of the building. Also available in bottles. Again, that was very unique at the time, and I believe this was very short-lived. He had already lost the brewery within a year, as we'll see, and there's no mention of bottling on the subsequent advertising, though I'm not sure. In April 1886, government agents entered the brewery and fined Brown for unspecified offenses, but allowed him to keep operating. But just a few months later, his brewer, M. Zickgraf, one of the only first names that I still have yet to locate in this whole presentation. I'd love to know what this guy's first name was. Zickgraf placed a lien on the business, resulting in public auction. Maybe he wasn't paid or something. In 1886, April 1886, Charles Calancini, owner of Ferndale's Milwaukee Brewery Depot, which was actually not a brewery. It was I think it was a brewery owned saloon, the Milwaukee Brewery being in San Francisco. Sylvia Camistro and Eureka wholesaler and Germany-born brewer August Palmtag purchased the brewery. It closed just about 2 years later. And around the same time, M. Zickgraf planned a brewery in Springville, now Fortuna, with Singley ferry operator Martin May. They purchased property, but it fell apart. And in May 1889, a mustard factory opened in the former Ferndale Brewery in Roberts Hall. I didn't find any information about that beyond this one ad, so I don't know that they were particularly successful. Next was the Pleasure Park Brewery. Again, my own name for this brewery, but it's where it was located. This was opened in February 1886 by James Hort. It also included a dance hall. And not a lot of information about this brewery. One of the only other articles that I found talked about this incident involving his brewery wagon, where the horse became frightened and ran away. Beer bottles were thrown promiscuously. The bed was deposited in another street. And the last scene of the horse, it was still going, was simply the running gear attached to him. That must have been pretty funny. In May 1886, Anton Hearn and Ernest Glatt purchased the brewery and announced that they were doing business as the Humboldt Brewery. So I don't know what brand Hort was using. Again, there are big gaps in the chronology of ownership. So this property is based around this house now, although this house was built much later, probably close to 20 years after the brewery. And if you are interested in buying it, it is for sale. And you can see it really kind of even still has the look of a park. Certainly there's a number of buildings that weren't there in the time of the Pleasure Park Brewery, but still a lot of this land is still undeveloped. And there's a picture of the inside because why not? Next was the Rick's Prairie Brewery. I'm not positive that this house was the property, but it's the only house anywhere near this part of town. And to me, it looks like an odd house architecturally. It looks like a 4/4, but there's no window on the left side. The front door is offset, and the roof itself seems oddly flat for this type of house. The windows are very close to the roof line. It makes me think it was something else. So maybe this was the brewery itself converted into a residence, or possibly may have been just the house associated with the brewery that may have been in a different location. Austria-born Simon Wofel purchased the brewery from Bartlett Glatt on August 1st, 1887. Bartlett was actually the father of August, who we talked about in the Pleasure Park Brewery. He definitely ran it as a brewery. It's referenced as such, but I don't know the actual date when that brewery opened. So I'm just listing the dates here as the first date that I can verify. I think this brewery may have been in a year or two earlier than this. And I got Rick's Prairie because that's how it's listed in the 1890 business directory. This part of town was called Rick's Prairie. And this is on Harris Street between P and O, I believe. And Wofel died pretty young in 1891 at 35 years of old. M. Zickgraf laid a claim on the property 2 months later. So I don't know where the connection there comes from. I'm still trying to figure this out, but there did seem to be a lot of crossover between ownership on these breweries. And so I think there were partnerships that weren't necessarily obvious or listed in deeds. Eventually, Patrick McAleenan from the Eureka Brewery purchased the property from his estate in 1891, later in 1891, and the brewery was listed among his assets that were seized in 1895. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. And after that, the trail on this brewery goes cold. The second half of the Eureka Brewery story picks up in 1891 when, again, McAleenan purchased the Rick's Prairie Brewery. In 1894, Peter Belcher took financial control of the brewery due to outstanding debt owed by McAleenan. And he never operated the brewery again. I don't know what happened here, but it seemed like he had problems throughout his time of owning breweries. And in fact, when he left the Eureka Brewery, or had it seized from him, I should say, he ultimately went to Fresno and tried to open a brewery there in 1897, eventually went to Dawson, Alaska to manage a brewery in 1901, and sadly died of typhoid in Fairbanks in 1907. In 1895, Switzerland-born John Ulrich Haltner, owner of the Santa Rosa Brewery, purchased the brand and the Eureka Brewery property from McAleenan's state. By the early 1890s, addresses had shifted and the brewery was redesignated 405 First Street. And at some point, Haltner formed a partnership with Hans Hendrickson, which dissolved in 1901. Again, I'm throwing out these names just in case people have more information about them. I assume that was a very short-lived partnership. On the right is kind of an odd ad because this dates back to 1898. This was in the California newspaper, and you can see that it's listed as the Eureka Brewing Company. It's the only time I can see this name being used. These ads on the left are later, 1903, and they're back to the Eureka Brewery. John Haltner formed a partnership with Humboldt Brewing Company owner Axel Johnson. We'll get to that story in a minute. And then February 1904, and they discontinued the Eureka Brewery brand, continuing just as the Humboldt Brewing Company, Humboldt Brewing Company, but in using the First Street Brewery. A syndicate of local and Los Angeles-based investors who'd begun constructing and adjoining lager and steam breweries on Broadway at Harris Street by late summer 1904 incorporated as the Eureka Brewing Company. So again, this didn't have any connection to Haltner's Eureka Brewery. And on January 31st, 1905, the brewing company purchased the Eureka Brewery from Haltner. 4 months later, the Humboldt Brewing Company purchased the property from the Eureka Brewing Company and immediately offered the property for rent. This is very convoluted, and I won't go into this too much, but there were some of the same people on the boards of both companies, and it's almost more of a name change than anything. They were closely related companies, but it becomes odd when they start selling things to themselves. In October 1905, just 4 months after the opening, the breweries on Broadway were destroyed. I'll talk about this later. The First Street Brewery was immediately reactivated and operated until at least 1909, when the second Broadway steam brewery was completed. And this is the Eureka Brewing wagon in front of the Needs building at 2nd and E. Next comes the F and 32nd Streets Brewery. Ireland-born Daniel Murray purchased the property on March 1st, 1885. In July 1890, Murray was appointed to the police force. Murray and M. Zickgraf from the Ferndale Brewery opened the United States Brewery in December 1890. And you can see the listing in the 1890 business directory, the head of F Street. This photo on the right was taken in the late 1940s. It's a Schuster image from HSU. And you can see on the right of the yellow square, this is F Street. And to the left of that, obviously, is E Street, but you can see that it ends a couple blocks before the brewery. So at that time, you had to enter the brewery through F Street, and there was something of an alleyway or a long driveway leading from F Street. I believe that the street to the south, or just across from where the brewery is, I'll show this in a future slide, was 32nd Street, now Manzanita Avenue. A third partner in the brewery, James Craig, sold his interest to Daniel Murray less than 3 months after his investment, which was made on January 20th, 1891. And the following month, on May 19th, Zickgraf also filed a motion to have his partnership dissolve and for a review of financial records, similar to what happened in Ferndale. 2 weeks later, on June 4th, 1891, Daniel Murray was booked for assault with a deadly weapon. So what happened here? Oops. Oh, there we go. Yesterday afternoon, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and read some of these and summarize some of them. There's quite a bit of information, but Murray shot James Craig, who is also the proprietor of the First Street Blue Anchor Saloon, and Mary Zickgraf, M. Zickgraf's wife, at the brewery. He was firing at geese that were in the backyard, had fired 3 shots, and on the 4th shot struck Mary Zickgraf and James Craig with shot from a number 10 shotgun. Craig had been hit in the forehead, left cheek, and Mary Zickgraf in the head, shoulder, and breast. neither one of them had fatal injuries. Murray had told them that he had told them not to allow their geese to run in the yard. And seeing that his warning had not been heeded, he took a shotgun and decided to take care of it. However, his defense, I thought this was interesting, his defense, when informed by A.J. Monroe that he had shot Craig in the neck, it is said that he stated that if he had known Craig was there, he would have killed him, or words to that effect. The business relation was far from pleasant for all of these partners right from the beginning with this brewery. And both of the wounded claimed that the shooting was intentional, as Murray had threatened their lives many times before. He was ultimately released on bail just 4 days later, and we'll talk about what happened. But in the meantime, he deputized Dr. Fred Lee Grant. Remember, he was on the police force, and to serve a process on Zickgraf. Seems like a conflict of interest to me, but the process and process server not meeting with approval of Zickgraf, he proceeded to remonstrate, with which Grant resented by whacking him over the head with a 6-shooter. Constant drama at this brewery. The following month, Zickgraf's civil case against Murray was dismissed. Zickgraf ultimately had to pay all the charges, but immediately filed a new suit naming additional defendants that included future brewery owner Henry Tornroth. And a month later, he was acquitted in both criminal cases resulting from the shooting. Just a few months later, on November 20th, Mary and M. Zickgraf were held close prisoners in their house on F Street from 7:30 in the evening to 4:30 in the morning by someone who kept shooting at them with heavy bullets. The house was torn to pieces, and they claimed to have seen who did the shooting, and they believed that it was Murray and Murray's son, Daniel Murray Jr. The following month, Zickgraf and a partner leased the defunct Woutenberg Brewery in Ukiah, so he didn't stick around to be shot at more. A year later, in December 1892, Zickgraf was living in Vancouver, Washington, when he sold his interest in the brewery to Daniel Murray Jr., so apparently the Ukiah Brewery didn't work out as either. On January 3rd, 1893, Bonham and Company announced that Daniel Murray was not associated with their brewing business. It's the only reference I see to these guys, but makes me think they must have been operating in this brewery if they felt it was necessary to disclude him from their operations. And 6 months later, William Kirsten and Company leased the brewery and operated as the Philadelphia Brewery at Eureka, and you can see this out on the right. One of his partners, Gustav Hang, transferred his interest to E. Ferrari and S.P. Lewis just a few months later. He ultimately mismanaged the business, then took the brewery team to Ferndale where he tried to sell it and collect some of the bills. The parties owing the bills were suspicious and called the sheriff, where he was arrested. So he tried to skip town. There was a small-sized riot at the Philadelphia Brewery. Daniel Murray was brought downtown with a 6-inch gash in the scalp on the right side of his head, caused by a blow from a rifle barrel. Just nonstop drama going on here. Turns out to have been a partnership settlement and has been in progress all week. They just basically threatened each other and accused each other, and it ultimately took 7 stitches to put his head back together. In this extension of this case, Kirsten claims that 2 of his employees stole money and information from his trunk on the night that the initial fight happened, and that Hang had also been involved in this. And I thought this was funny because it says that when they were freed on bond, that Hang and Wagner drove triumphantly away with the 2 men to finish brewing a beer that they had on hand. So they sprung them from jail so they could go to work. And the charges and counter charges were all dismissed ultimately, and Kirsten basically left the county, not wishing to carry on to the road overland, and will probably be well on his way to San Francisco. On November 23rd, 1893, Murray leased the brewery to William Rooney and John Deignan. Eagle House owner Henry Tornroth purchased the brewery and surrounding property on February 6, 1895, and 2 months later, he canceled the lease that Rooney and Deignan had. And subsequent brewing activities unknown until late 1892 or 1902. I assume that Tornroth was brewing. He had a saloon in the Eagle House, and it may have been that he was supplying that and not advertising, but there's no mention of it in anything I've found so far. But in November of 1902, Franz Fischer, Carl Bulbridge, and Anton Wickstrom purchased the property and began operating as the Humboldt Brewing Company, the first time that name actually comes up. It had always been the Humboldt Brewery prior to that. Fisher sold his interest to his partners right away on February 23rd, 1903. On June 20th, Axel Johnson purchased the property. And by February 1904, he had become partners with John Haltner and the Eureka Brewery. As I mentioned earlier, they carried on business as the Humboldt Brewing Company. And again, as mentioned, the Eureka Brewery purchased the property from Haltner. They also purchased the F and 32nd Street on the same day. The brewery was converted to a residence, and then in 1962, when E Street was extended, the house was turned 90 degrees and moved to the eastern side of the street. And the house is still there today. And this is it. And this is another one of those. You can notice it looks quite a bit like a house to me, but I find the window in the top right to be a little odd. Perhaps that was the brew room where the kettle was, but I don't know for sure. And before I move on, I want to talk just briefly about a couple of other breweries that came to Eureka various times and considered opening branches here. The first being the Gambrius Brewery of Portland in August of 1903. And then, so that I don't have to backtrack later on, the Humboldt Times reported in February 1904 that the owners of the Mount Hood Brewery in Portland were also considering opening breweries and a brewery in Eureka. Neither one of these came to anything though. Breweries on Broadway from 1904. Rumors of a new brewery began to appear early in that year. Again, there had already been some indication from the year before, and even in these early articles, people were confused as to who this actually was, thinking it might have been the Gambrius people. You can see here the names of the people that were involved. There were a lot of stockholders. I'm not sure exactly who was who, other than Dorer was the president and Cressman was the vice president. August Palmtag had actually ultimately purchased the property at some point and sold it to a number of these people later in 1904, but he continued to be involved. And by August 1904, they were calling themselves the Eureka Brewing Company. And a 3-acre site was purchased on the west side of Broadway in the McDonald track, and they were constructing by October 1904. So by this point, this ad on the right is from February 1905, and you can see that this is really the one and only ad I actually have that shows the name Eureka Brewing Company, because by the time the brewery itself was, the Broadway brewery is completed, they were calling themselves the Humboldt Brewing Company. On October 19th, 1904, President and Vice President petitioned the Eureka City Council for the installation of a fire hydrant in the vicinity of the brewery. Anybody that knows this story knows the significance of that. 2 months later, on December 12, 1904, Paul Max Coonrich, president of the Los Angeles Brewing Company, purchased the Humboldt Brewing Company. And Coonrich had previously worked for the American Brewing Academy of Chicago in some sort of a traveling position in sales, eventually establishing the Los Angeles Brewing Company in 1897. Construction was complete by March 1905, and I'm going to read a quick little overview of some of the equipment that I've had in my article from 2019. The state-of-the-art brewery featured a 110-barrel copper brew kettle and a malt room with a 60,000-pound capacity. Modern refrigeration technology allowed for rapid cooling after the beer was boiled, and cold storage was used in the subsequent stages. The 12 oak holding tanks in the fermentation room could each hold 80 barrels, while the stock room contained the same number of 150 barrel tanks. Adjoining the south side of the brewery, which produced lagers, was a second brewery for steam beer. On June 8th, 1905, the brewery opened, offering free barbecue and beer to a crowd of more than 5,000 people. Many rode the Humboldt Transit Company's streetcar to the brewery, and the Eureka military band performed throughout the afternoon. There's an ad on the right showing the events of the day. Accounts of the day's unscheduled activities vary widely. According to one attendee, an altercation occurred between two men and was quickly deflected away from the crowd. Others remembered events differently, one stating that the affair wound up with a bunch of the most interesting battles ever waged in the city. And another said, the brew took effect on many of the revelers, and the World War started and was fought all the way from the brewery to 4th Street. You can see the brewery here. This is a really interesting photo. It's the only photo I've ever seen of this brewery. Again, it only existed for 4 months after opening. This is almost definitely opening day. You can see a lot of people here. I believe I can see bunting between the buildings. It's hard to see, but it's there. And this was actually a glass plate that was found underneath a house in Eureka in 1966. And somebody scanned it, and it was printed in a newspaper, and eventually a copy made its way to the Historical Society. If anybody out there knows where this glass plate is, it would be really amazing to scan it with modern scanners and new technology, and possibly be able to learn a lot more detail. A lot of the damage that's done to this plate is kind of interesting. If you notice up on the top left, where the arrow just showed up, and then to the right of the building, these are kind of interesting images. They kind of almost look like dragons to me, if you're into that sort of thing. And considering that the brewery was burned to the ground 4 months after this photo was taken, I just find that really interesting damage. You have to let me know what you thought. So coals left under a cauldron of pitch in the barrel room, which was located in the steam brewery that was unfortunately attached to the lager brewery, were determined to be the source. The fire began at night, and by the time it was discovered early the next morning, it had damaged the brewery's fire suppression system that was hooked up to their steam tanks, steam engines, I mean. Hydrants had yet to be installed in the area, so the hook and ladder and engine companies that responded were unable to control the spread of the inferno, which ultimately destroyed the 5-story lager brewery. By midday, only the carpentry shop, stables, and bottling plant remained. But almost immediately, the company announced that they would rebuild, and they reopened the First Street Brewery and retrofitted it to become a steam brew that they could use while producing their lager beers in the Los Angeles Brewing Company plant. You can see they gave a description of what the new building would be like, showing where things would be located. This is an interesting photo on the left that I found from the San Francisco Chronicle, I believe, that shows the brewery in construction. And the chimney looks a little strange. It didn't end up being a brick chimney quite like the photos on the right. But as Jim Garrison at the Historical Society pointed out to me, he thinks that this was just the actual metal pipe, and that they had yet to put the masonry work around it at all. He's looked odd to me, and I think he figured that out. We'll see that in the next photo. Valentine Katzenberger from Los Angeles was hired to build this building. Oh, I guess we'll have to wait for that slide. In 1907, in July of 1907, Kuhnrich sold the brewery, the Los Angeles Brewing Company, including the assets, including the Humboldt Brewing Company, to George Zobeling. George Zobeling was a German immigrant who, sorry, hang on, I'm finding my notes. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, George Zoebling arrived in Los Angeles in 1869, and after operating a grocery store for several years, began working at his father's New York brewery on Main Street. In 1882, he partnered with fellow German immigrant Joseph Mayer to purchase another early Los Angeles brewery, the 8-year-old Philadelphia Brewhouse. They renamed it Mayer and Zoebling and offered employees the incredible incentive of 7-minute beer breaks every hour. The partnership continued until the death of Mayer in 1904. Tension developed between Zoebling and Mayer's heirs, and they parted following a lawsuit in early 1907. So here we see the Mayer and Zoebling advertising and labels. The Mayers continued as Mayer Brewing Company, here we see on the right, and Zoebling again bought the Los Angeles Brewing Company. And you can see that he changed the label a bit after he bought it to include his name. Again, the primary purchase was the Los Angeles Brewing Company, so he ultimately bought the Humboldt Brewing Company for $1. And at that time, a few months after, it was reported that the output of the brewery was 35,000 barrels. And I'm not going to read this whole article, but I'm going to show you just how much column space was given to this story. But the gist of this story is that when Kuhnrich sold the brewery, he forgot to transfer the title legally. And ultimately, the brewery owners were, Zoebling and the other brewery owners were concerned that not that he would actually be able to stop their business, because one of the lots that he had transferred was the brewery itself, but he still had on paper ownership of the well source, and they were afraid that he could cut them off for their water source. So they made it a point to understandably have all of this taken care of. But just interesting that that Kuhnrich would not finish transferring the property legally. It's kind of funny. Kuhnrich eventually, after he is no longer involved in the brewery, he became appointed to Governor Gillette's staff as lieutenant colonel, and Gillette was actually from Eureka, might have been Gillette. And by 1915, he was a courier for the State Department, delivering classified documents. In 1920, he was secretary of the American Red Cross in Berlin. So Kuhnrich had quite an eventful life before and after he was involved in the Humboldt Brewing Company. Again, I'm not going to read this whole article. This will be posted on YouTube at some point. If you'd like to pause it, you can read this. I've given you the gist of what happened. And probably the best photo of the Humboldt Brewing Company. It really shows the entire plant as it existed prior to Prohibition. There was some additional buildings added later on. And you can see clearly that the brick building, the large brick building, this was the Lager brewery, and the building to the left of that was the steam brewery. And these were completely separate breweries. They shared bottling, and obviously we're using the same stables for delivery and such, but otherwise they were completely autonomous from one another. A little closer, and you can see beyond the trees beyond. I don't know whether it would have been the case in this photo, but there is an indication that this brewery had opened a beer garden in that spot. So this would have been long gone by the World War II, because the subsequent brewery, the Humboldt Malton Brewing Company, expanded into that space. And I've never seen photos, but apparently there is or would be a beer garden in that space at some point. Shots of the office where the bottling was also done. These are some of the Beer Ziegler photos from 1909 of the interior bottling operations at the brewery. And a couple ads from a little bit earlier. You can see in this top right ad that the address is 2996 to 3048. By the time the next brewery, the Humboldt Malton Brewing Company, closed, the address would be 2700 to 3150. So they really extended quite a ways down Broadway. This is the Chuck Petty photo that I mentioned earlier. thank you again, Chuck. This is a great photo. You can see this leather straps that were used, maybe canvas, to run the equipment. And I imagine this is probably something along this lines is how Charlie Marhoffer got his foot caught in the machinery and was injured for the rest of his life because of it. It's a pretty severe injury, and he probably got it caught in one of these types of machineries. A couple ads. 1908 on the top, and then 1914 on the bottom. And this is actually the only beer that I know of from Humboldt Brewing Company from that era that I've never seen a label for. So if anybody out there has a Humboldt Bock beer label, I would greatly love to see that and add this to this collection. Some of the staff and a much larger amount of the staff. And then in fact, I think the guy, not quite in the center right under the barrel, but the guy to the left of him may be John Hagen, who was the manager of the brewery from 1911 until it closed in Prohibition. And he apparently was responsible for a lot of improvements that happened in the brewery and cared about cleanliness and really tried to up the production and all kinds of things that were really good for the brewery. In fact, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but the brewery was really thriving when Prohibition came along. Beginning in 1908, in August of 1910, and extending through to July of 1917, I have now located about 630 unique ads from the Humboldt Brewing Company. These four are just 4 of 9 ads that were placed in the single month of November 1915. You can see these again, some of these are very short. Most of them are about this long, some are quite lengthy. And there were, again, well over 600 of them, probably more. I don't think that I found everything. I'm having these transcribed because not all of them are particularly readable. A lot of them are more plain than this, but a really incredible series of ads that came out of that brewery, something that I think is probably pretty unique in American advertising. I really don't know, but for that many ads to come out of this length is something unique. And a few of the labels. This was an interesting, actually, let me go back to that one. This is a Humboldt Beer Company in Oakland. This is the only copy of this ad I've ever seen. It's decent quality, so I'm looking for a better quality if anybody out there has one. This is the same ad we've seen a couple times, but as some of you are watching this on a small screen, I wanted to show it full screens. I did a lot of background information on these, looking at labels just to sort of understand where Humboldt's fell and artistic interest and things like that. And I actually find that the Humboldt series of labels are some of the most interesting labels that I found. I looked at several thousand, and I think these are some of the most interesting labels. And I think that this is one of my favorites of all, in addition to one of them I'm going to show you in a second, the Alpenweiss. In 1915, the company signed a deal with the Wagner distributing company in San Francisco to produce several beers for them to sell in their stores. And I think this is a great label. And I found this little medallion online. Thought I'd show that here. And then the top right and bottom left were also Wagner Distributing Company. The bottom left is not confirmed, but Bob Kay, who was a major label collector, printed a whole bunch of books on labels from pre-Prohibition breweries. He believed that this was a Humboldt label, but every other one of them was definitely from that brewery. And being that they had made 2 others, I assume as well. Just a little break. The Seattle Rainier Brewing Company and Seattle Malt and Brewing Company, the Rainier beer makers in Seattle, had to leave because of Prohibition beginning January 1st, 1916. And at that time, the Eureka Chamber of Commerce tried to have them locate to the Bay. It didn't happen. They went to San Francisco, but I thought that it was interesting that the Chamber of Commerce was actually soliciting for this to happen, and that's an interesting what if, because that would have been a huge, huge brewery. Some of the merchandise that came out of the brewery is quite interesting, and I'm trying to chronicle every bit of it that I can find. I'd love to go back at some point and take photos of these with fill lights and a nice mount that shoots it directly from above, but I'm pretty happy with the way these came out anyway. And some of these came from local collectors, some of them came from the internet, and I'm looking for more, and I'm looking for better quality images than any of these. If anybody can help me out with that, that'd be fantastic. If you'll notice the glass sign on the bottom, there was actually two versions of this, but I didn't want to take the space. So here's the second. I was actually really happy with the way that transition worked. And by early 1917, the production was up to 50,000 barrels a year, and they continued to grow all the time. This was pretty comical. August Paulette, a brewery worker who has refused to subscribe to the Red Cross, the Liberty Loan, or War Stamp, narrowly escaped a coat of tar and feathers last evening at the hands of his coworkers who disapproved of his refusal to contribute. When told that he was likely to have serious trouble with the workmen at the brewery, he persisted in his refusal to sign the War Stamp pledge. Paulette said he would sign, but when called upon later, he again declined, and ultimately said he was going to pay in San Francisco, where he was headed that day. Careful. The Humboldt Brewing Company ultimately was not closed by Prohibition, but the Wartime Prohibition Act as a way of saving resources, barley and such. And at that time, the Eureka had 63 saloons in 1919. I believe the number has been estimated as high as 80 at a certain point, and maybe 70 being a more average number. But in addition to the 6 that closed at that time, the brewery was also closed, closing down on July 1st. They ceased their operations January 1st, but they were still able to package and sell the rest of the remaining beer. And I included this because I thought it was interesting that the city knew that there were as many as 300 people that were conducting illegal home breweries and distilleries, considering that it's been estimated that Eureka had 100 to 200 speakeasies. I guess we can see where they're getting their beer. And I included this fact because I know some of the Humboldt home brewers are here today or be watching this at some point. And thanks to Jimmy Carter's House Resolution 1337, homebrewing became federally legal in 1979 and has really opened the way for the brewing industry as it exists today. During Prohibition, 2 brewery watchmen were employed to basically turn the machinery on and just keep it in working order and make sure nobody was breaking in. There's some indication that it might have been used as a cold storage plant, but I'm not positive whether that actually happened or was just a plan. And then later in 1927, the machinery was dismantled and sold to Miguel Contales and Company to be used in their Mexicali brewery. In early 1933, George Mullen purchased the brewery. The Zobelin family had been trying to sell it for a while, and finally, just as Prohibition was looking to be clearly on its way out, he went ahead and purchased the brewery. He was actually one of the brewery was one of the first to open. I want to say that it was something like 40 breweries opened up in the first part of 33, and then by early 34 it was something like 700 and something. And so this was one of the first 40 breweries to reopen after Prohibition. He offered stock and then almost immediately rescinded it. I'm not sure why. There's even an article where he talks about why he did it, and it's still not clear why. He just said that he did it and now he doesn't want to. On June 23rd, 1933, the company signed a $23 million contract with Western States grocery stores. They owned 3,300 McMar, Piggly, Wiggly, Safeway, and Skaggs stores. The contract was to produce 75,000 barrels a year of Brown Derby and Humboldt beer. And this was for 10 years. And at the time, it was the largest single beer deal ever negotiated in US history. These were a couple ads from 1933. These were found in the Medford Mail, the Oakland Tribune, and the La Grande, Oregon Observer. They're not particularly readable. They're not great quality, but there were several more that I found, and they were all used, at least the Brown Derby all used this late 1890s imagery. A couple more labels. The Humboldt, the images on the top left and bottom right are the top and bottom of the same stationery. Their ales, as opposed to any of their lagers or pilsners, the ales were always used this oval shape, which I thought was interesting. And a few more of the labels, a lot of these being like a contract beer, the one in the gold medal for the Associated Growers Co-op of Seattle, monogram for the San Francisco Grocery Company. And if you'll notice, the LISCO doesn't actually say Humboldt Malt and Brewing, but it does say permit number California U1121. I'm highlighting it here now. And that was the permit number for the brewery. So you can identify anything, even if it doesn't say it, through that information. We'll see another image with that same number on it. This is a really interesting shot because this was taken from roughly from the northern edge of Fort Humboldt. The street you see down here doesn't exist anymore. It was called Cooper Street or Cooper Lane. And you can see Harris going up the hill on the other side. And you can see as well, this is after the Humboldt Malt and Brewing Company had done some major expansions, including adding an enormous warehouse where the beer garden that I mentioned earlier in the trees would have been. And they also added quite a bit of floor space to the lager brewery itself, extending onto the back of the building. They combined the offices and steam brewery into more or less one building. Overall added quite a bit of square footage to their operations during 33 to about 36, 37. This is another stationery. In 1936, the company started canning. It was a very new technology, and they were one of the relatively first few breweries to incorporate this new technology. You can see the Brown Derby, Humboldt beer, and Eureka lagers. And then the associated here also doesn't say anything about where it was made, but it does have the U1121 permit number on it. Brown Derby, you can see the back open quickly, and it was keg lined. Interesting that they would need a demonstration on how to open the can, but again, these were brand new. Zest beer, I'm not 100% sure that this was a Humboldt brand, but it was listed on the website that I found it. That really didn't give me a lot of information, but did identify it as such. So possibly, and this LISCO, I'm not sure if this can was from that era. It certainly looks like the same era can. And LISCO was definitely made by the Humboldt Brewing Company, but it was also made by other breweries later. So I don't know about this can. On April 2nd, 1838, the Blue Lake Advocate reported that thousands of cans and bottles of beer from the Humboldt Malt and Brewing Company were strewn about the intersection of 4th and Broadway in Eureka Thursday night, when the side of a huge truck and trailer gave way on a turn and spilled nearly half of its load of case goods into the street. So that's kind of the second time we have a story about beer flowing on the streets of Eureka. The Western States Grocery Company in the late 1930s pulled out of their contract with the brewery They gave a number of different reasons actually over time. It's never been really clear. They cited poor quality, inability to keep up with demand, any number of things. The company had right of first refusal, which meant that in addition to the 75,000 barrels that they were contracted, if the brewery produced more than that, Western states had first dibs on that, which meant that they really couldn't promise anyone else a certain amount of beer. It was a sort of, well, if we have any left at the end of the year, it'll be yours. But that wasn't very good business practice. You couldn't really retain other clients. And so when the Western states pulled out, it really just completely crippled the brewery, and they ultimately went into bankruptcy and sued the organization as well as a couple of the breweries that it went to, including the Rainier and Los Angeles Brewing Company, ironically enough. And they asked for triple indemnity because it was an antitrust case. But in the end, they only ultimately ended up bringing in $100,000. So a huge loss to the investors and a big loss to the city as well. You can see here it's been adjudged bankrupt in February 21, 1940. And it was being foreclosed upon by the following year. And then again, the results of the case where they ultimately ended up with just $100,000 of the $2.25 million that they were asking for. It turned out that they had only had an oral contract. So I guess get everything in writing. And here's the brewery, or the brewing site as it existed in 1948. Again, another Schuster photo. And this really shows just the size of the complex. You can see there on the left is the warehouse that was added by the Humboldt Mullen Brewing Company. And they actually added a spur line. You can see a couple box cars behind that same building on the left, and you can see the tracks. They added scales for highway scales, although I've never actually been able to see any indication of them. They did all kinds of improvements to this property, and every indication was that just like the Humboldt Brewing Company in pre-prohibition era, that until this contract was pulled with by Western states, that this brewery was also doing extremely well. In 1936, it was the sixth largest in California. There's no indication that they would have gone under had it not been for that abrupt change in their status with Western states taking their output. Getting a little closer, and you can see, if you remember from some of the earlier photos, some of the changes that they had made in the 30s to the facades of the building as well. And at this point, this is poultry producers of Northern California, including new laid eggs. A big portion of this was all being leased by the poultry producers. Before we move on, let's talk a little bit about Brown Derby. It was a pretty iconic label, and it still it pops up again in revival brewing even to this day. It was inspired by the Brown Derby restaurant in Los Angeles, where you could eat in the hat. This is a neat building inside too. I found some photos, but they were very pixelated, so I didn't include them here, but a really interesting restaurant that no longer exists. I believe that there are other locations that didn't look anything like this, but the Brown Derby may still exist, just not in Los Angeles in this location or in that cool hat. After the Western states pulled out, they had a number of breweries, and this is only a partial list. I just thought this was really interesting to visually to see that they started East Idaho Brewing, Grace Brothers, Los Angeles Brewing, Rainier Brewing, Pacific Brewing and Malting, a different Los Angeles Brewing, Mayer. So both Mayer and Los Angeles both brewed this beer. And then General Brewing in Tumwater, Washington. This was a much more recent, I want to say 1980s. And there were a bunch of other breweries as well. So this really made the rounds and has existed as a brand in one form or another for well over 90 years, I suppose. But Humboldt does seem to be the first place that it was ever brewed. Okay. I think at this point, if I can figure out how to get out of this, that this is a good time to do a Q&A before we start the modern section of the discussion. So Corin, is that something that you can help me?
Yeah, so we just had a couple questions in the chat. The first one, they're asking, in one of the ads offered beer that was pink and sparkling. Would that be a good thing? Is that like, what makes a pink sparkling beer?
That's a fantastic question. I've often wondered about that myself. I don't know. I've really never seen a pink beer myself, other than something that was being made with non-traditional ingredients. Many of the ads that I found, it's interesting what people would have thought was a worthwhile information to convey to their customers, because there was a lot of the information was about how it would help with your health. It could cure any number of ailments that you might have. It was good for strength and vitality, and so I don't know. I'm not sure why pink would have been the ideal color to choose there.
All right, and then another question was, what would have been the water source for various brewery locations? There are some springs on Broadway, but other locations they have used well water, and would the quality of the water matter that much?
That I don't do any home brewing myself, but I understand that water is, probably one of the most important steps in brewing. So absolutely, that would have made an enormous difference. And in fact, when the Gambrius and later the Eureka Brewing Company and some of these other organizations came to the area, they had the water tested, actually sent it off to labs to have it analyzed, and that was one of their main rationale for whether they would open a brewery in a particular location. The Humboldt Brewing Company, they sunk their own wells. John Hagen, who became the manager in 1911, he actually had wells sunk. And there for a long time, the springs that were located across Broadway from the brewery, and I think actually on the top of the hill, the public could come and fill up their water there as well. And then the city ultimately talked about sinking more because of the success that the brewery had had in their wells. The water here, whether it was true or not, it was advertised as the best in the West and the purest water in the West, I think was the actual quote. So absolutely. And I would tend to imagine that, I don't know this for sure. I'm sort of just guessing based on some of the information I've seen, that would have been a primary criteria as to where to locate a brewery. I think a lot of these early breweries would have had springs, and then maybe later on we're talking about wells being established. It's not something that is clear in any of the information I've seen so far. Really, the Humboldt Brewing Company talks about their water source at all. But as I'm sure anybody that has studied this area knows, there are springs all over the place and water sources. So again, I think that would have been a primary thing that they would have looked at when they were deciding where to put these breweries.
All right, so that takes care of our questions in the chat. So I think we can continue on.
Okay, great. Okay, let me see. Give me 1 second here. Okay, sorry, I just want to make sure I wasn't missing anything from the first half. After a 47-year gap, the Humboldt Brewery opened in Arcata in 1907. It was opened by former NFL linebacker Mario Collado and his brother Vince. And it was located at 856 10th Street in Arcata. And this brewery it was a brewery on the left and a performance space on the right called the International Beer Garden. And if I'm correct, I believe that this had also been Tsunamis and Topper's 856 Club and a number of live performance spaces in a couple of different iterations of the same performance space. And I think this is actually a really interesting location for future study on some of the people that have performed there. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the people that I know of, but before and after the era of the Humboldt Brewing Company, there have been some amazing artists that have performed there. So future topic for somebody to research. It was California's sixth microbrewery, and again, it was the first locally owned brewery since 1904. On opening day, all 2,400 gallons of the brewery supply was depleted. That was pretty successful day. I don't think they obviously anticipated for that because it was 10 days before they could reopen. I've been trying really hard to get a hold of any interior photos I can. I'm interested in any of the breweries, but this one particularly because it's been gone for so long, and it had gone through so many changes in its first few years. I believe this is the brewery as existed before the expansion and removal of the International Beer Garden. And so even though some of the elements like the brick arch and things remained, there were definitely changes. So I'd really love to get photos from both eras, and then even from the Humboldt brews that it became afterwards, which we'll talk about in a minute. So again, these interior photos are something, if anybody out there has any, it would be very helpful to have. Here's Mario and some of the teams or all of the teams that he played on in 1981 as part of the Los Angeles Ram. He was a champion of Super Bowl 15. And his brother Vince in looks like the bottling area. They had these English hand pumps. This photo was actually part of the Celebrator Beer News story from 1992, and the owner Tim was kind enough to send me this. I believe the photo on the left may have been part of that same article, but these were traditional English hand pumps that were not something you really see in most breweries anymore, at least in the US. This is really one of my favorite labels, the aesthetics part of the story. I mentioned earlier the ads, but as far as the labels, that was another thing that really grabbed my attention. And this is one of my favorites, and I'd remembered it, but I hadn't seen it in years. And this particular beer was made for Mario's friend, John Matutsak, and that used to occasionally come up to the brewery. In the first couple of years that it was open, they had both been on the Los Angeles Raiders during that Super Bowl winning year. Matutsak had also, beginning in 1979, started a side career as an actor, appearing in North Dallas 40 with Nick Nolte, Caveman with Ringo Starr and Ringo Starr's future wife, Barbara Bach, Dennis Quaid, Shelley Long, Ice Pirates with what's that guy, John Urich, Spencer for Hire. His most famous role was in The Goonies, where some of you probably don't recognize him, but he was everybody's favorite character, Sloth. And his final role was in One Crazy Summer, or his final major role, I should say. One of my favorite movies, although I need to rewatch it to find out who he was in that movie. I just don't remember. And then, because why not? Here's some of the TV shows that he guest starred on as well. Unfortunately, John Matutsak died in 1989. So he was just getting started with his film career. It's interesting to see what he might have done. Something I found online. I'm not really sure. It's something that I kind of think was a print on demand sort of thing, but it's still pretty interesting. These are a couple of the advertisements for individual months at the International Beer Garden. You can see just in these few ads that Buckwheat Zydeco, Lady Smith Black Mambo, Michael McDonald's of the Doobie Brothers, B.B. King, Al Stewart, Herbie Mann, Randy Newman, et cetera, et cetera. So this was a really, really interesting performance venue where you could see some great names in a very small, intimate space. And then on the right here, I've been trying to document any of the beers themselves that came out of the Humboldt Brewing Company. That's something I'm interested in all the breweries, but again, because they've been gone so long, it was something that is a little harder to locate people that remember this stuff sometimes. Yeah, BB King, Randy Newman, Canned Heat, Fish, some of the other people that performed there. And the reason that it was taken out was to add a 50-barrel brewing system. And already by the following year, they had reached 20,000 barrels. So they expanded and then really quickly ended up even outgrowing that same or that extended brewing system. In somewhere by 1987 anyway, they had changed their logo and they were now calling themselves the Humboldt Brewing Company, again, starting as the Humboldt Brewery. And part of my, again, plan to or want to show you as many interior photos as I have. Luckily, I took some photos myself in 1995 of a band. And even though it's not very clear, there's enough elements in these photos that can kind of give an idea of what the brewery looked like after the expansion. And what I'm really hoping is that some of the people that used to go in there, work there, familiar with this brewery, that it'll just kind of spark some memories for some of you. So I'm going to go through several photos here. And if you're wondering why I have placed this logo twice, it's so that I could use my favorite PowerPoint transition. It's just one that I think can only be used once. This is January 19th, 1995. This band is called Durango 95. As you can see, they're originally from New York, had moved out here, formed a band, recorded an EP, ultimately left and broke up. But I thought that they were a great, super fun live band and great songwriters, I thought. And so on the top left, you can see this is a photo that actually hung above the windows. Below that is Jason Gussman on drums here, and that would have been over his right shoulder. And then beyond him, you can see there's a brewery, some sort of brewery sign, and that's actually a stairwell, which I wouldn't have remembered, except that I had some other photos from the series where I was up above. So I know that there's a staircase there now. On the right, you can see on the far right top corner, you can see a football hanging up above one of the doors. And then to the left of that, you can see a bunch of cases with glassware in them. These were Dan Forbes, local collector's collection. And these were all over this brewery and probably one of the main reasons that I became interested in breweries. Even before I could go to them and order a drink, I was going to these places, Humboldt and Las Cosas restaurants, and the Humboldt was always somewhere in particular. I always loved to walk around and look at all the advertising and glassware. So this brewery really was a major inspiration for me giving this presentation today. All right, so behind David here, we have more of Dan Forbes glassware. You can see to the left a gold rush sign, and then you can see the windows that were part of the viewing area for the brewery room. Behind Ian here, we have some oval signs that are pretty clear as to what's going on here. I don't know what the photos on the right are. It's been far too many years for me to remember. But again, people that remember this brewery probably know exactly what those photos were. So I thought it'd be worth showing just as a way to spark memory. Over the door, when you first came in, there were some of his Colado's Oakland Raider jerseys and a bunch of glassware and also merchandise display cases behind Jason. You can see some of the lighting. I guess those would be carriage lights. You can see a couple other jerseys to the far left of the stacks that are behind David Robertson. You can see again that photo that hung above the windows and the Humboldt Brewing sign on the top right. The Humboldt volleyball team. I wish Ian's head weren't in the way, but I wasn't necessarily trying to take a picture of the volleyball team that night. So I'm glad we were able to catch some of it though. And then on the left, we have more of Dan Forbes glassware. To the right of the back of David's head, we have a shot of the Humboldt Brewing Company that we looked at before from the vantage point of the bottling plant. More of the lights, and you can see some of the signage. And in the bottom photo, you can see more of the glassware, a large photo of John Matusak, and a number of the people that had performed prior to this photo being taken. Again, I wish I could go back in time and take pictures of that wall so that I could know some of the more of the people that had performed there. So that's information I'm looking for from anybody out there. And because I've shown you quite a bit of Durango 95, I figured I would go ahead and give them their due as well. There's their logo on their album. Later on, after they broke up, David Baumler, who had been already a filmmaker, went on to do a number of short films and has been pretty successful in showing them at film festivals over the years. And if you're interested, you can still hear their music today on SoundCloud. They named themselves after this car, as it was known in Stanley Kubrick's film A Clockwork Orange, from the line, the Durango 95 Perdaway Real Horror Show. They had actually stolen that car. And it was actually a Probe 16 that was manufactured in England by the Adams brothers in 1969. There were only 3 made, and at last check, that all 3 still existed, but really interesting car. These are all the major label variations that I'm aware of for the Humboldt Brewing Company. Some I have very good quality, some of these are not so good, so I can blow some of these up indefinitely and they look great, and others are about as big as they can be. So again, if you have labels out there, please send them my way. I'll give you information at the end. A couple of these labels close up. Still unable to meet demand. Beginning in 2000, the bottled line was contract brewed in Paso Robles by the Firestone Walker Brewing Company, and the Arcata brewers scaled back to on-site consumption only. I don't know exactly how long that lasted. But the brew pub closed in 2003, and this was the same year that the brewery was awarded Mid-Size Brewery of the Year at the Great American Beer Festival. Firestone Walker purchased all the remaining stock in 2005 and renamed the line the Nectar Ales. The brew pub's 50-barrel system that they'd put in 1992 was sold to Ballast Point in San Diego. The brand was dormant until Total Beverage Solution purchased Nectar Ales in 2012 and changed. They also owned Mendocino and a few others. They purchased the name and changed it back to Humboldt Brewing Company in 2013. Firestone Walker continued to brew through 15, Mendocino until they closed in January 2018, and at least once in 2019, Lost Coast ran a batch of the hemp ale. I don't know if they did anything else, something I'm going to try to find more information about. And this is from the second era, the 2013 to 2018 era, and the redesigned labels. When the Humboldt operations closed in 2003, a bunch of the employees grouped together to buy the business, changing the name to Humboldt Brews. And then over the years, eventually David Ardell purchased the remaining shares and is the sole owner. And in 2019, he and his brother, Andy Ardell, and in 2019, he and his brother David actually purchased the Humboldt Brewing rights, and just last month released their first Humboldt brewed beer under local ownership that was on tap. So they have another one in the works, and we'll see what happens. But for the first time in many years, the Humboldt Brewing Company is locally owned again and has a future still. So that's great. The offices are being run out of Humboldt Brews right now. Hum Brews. In 1989, the Mad River Company was founded by Robert Smith, an award-winning homebrewer. He had been homebrewing since '67, and he developed the Steelhead and Jamaica lines in his garage in the '60s and or '70s and '80s. He had a de facto business plan for the Humboldt Bay Brewing Company, written by '82. He'd originally planned to put it in Arcata, but of course, by the time he opened his brewery, there was already the Humboldt Brewing Company, so he changed his name. Due to permitting and numerous other legal factors, most breweries take years to establish, and he was ultimately opened in the Mad River Blue Lake Industrial Park, including part of the Sierra Nevada original brewing system and Anchor Brewing Company's mid-century bottling line. I believe he also, if I'm not mixing my stories up, he also used a bunch of old dairy equipment and fashioned a bunch of his own equipment as well as stuff that he bought from Sierra Nevada and Anchor. Here we see some early photos of Robert Smith. And in around 2000, I believe, Dylan Schatz joined the team and ultimately worked his way up to head brewer. In 2010, he was awarded the Small Brewing Company Brewer of the Year by the Great American Brew Festival, basically the highest honor that you can win in that field. There's their logo. And in 2016, Robert Smith had long been had sold his interest, I believe, or at least had stepped down from active management long before 2016, when a new brewing system, I think it's a 60,000 barrel a year, state-of-the-art system was put in place. Some of the labels from over the years, the Steelhead and the Jamaica on the top row being the oldest. Again, a lot of different lines that they have. The John Barleycorn is a seasonal release that, at least for the first 15 years, had a different label every year, a different recipe, and actually included a stanza of a poem that, if you read them over the years, you could eventually read the entire poem. I'm working on getting those for this collection. Some label changes that came later. This is an odd design. I wonder if it was just conceptual or whether it actually was ever used anywhere, but it was one that I found online and I'd never seen it. And in 2019, the Yurok tribe purchased the Mad River Brewing Company, and they've begun they've changed the logo, and they are starting to change the labels and bring new products to market. So interesting time as far as ownership changes go with a lot of these breweries. In 1989, or in 1989, a little later in that same year, Barbara Grimm and Wendy Pound were the first women in the U.S. to start a brewery. They opened in the former Pythian Castle on 4th Street in Eureka. They had actually begun planning in '84, but as I said, a lot of breweries took forever to open, and so brewery finally opened in '89. I think the cafe opened the following year. And this was actually used the first commercially produced brewing system in America. Barbara Groom, a former pharmacist, had purchased the equipment at an auction, and she told me that when she got it home, she had been used by the Reading Brewing Company, and that when she got it home, she realized they hadn't cleaned it and it had been sitting in a storage unit for about 6 months in the summer in Reading. You can imagine what a horrible mess that was, and it delayed their first batch. The Lost Coast operates as a subsidiary of Table Bluff Brewing Company, and that was what Barbara Grimm called her garage, where a lot of her early recipes were developed. She had originally actually planned on having a number of different brands under that, so there would have been maybe the Table Bluff Brewing Company would have been the umbrella, and then Lost Coast, and maybe a Reading Brewing or wherever. But she said that opening one proved to be hard enough. Although very recently, the Lost Coast has expanded into cider making with Edge of the Continent ciders. So there are now actually 2 different brands under that umbrella. This is the Pythian Castle. little closer to how it originally looked, although already even by this point, there was wrought iron work along the top and some finials that are missing from this photo, but this is still relatively intact with its onion tower and pop-out bay windows, and really interesting building that really doesn't look much like that today anymore, fortunately. This was a early photo that was used in some ads around 90, 91. And it's interesting, they all seem to be holding up beer glasses. I don't think it's local necessarily though. Here's Barbara putting up the sign on the outside of the building. This was the first label. They started with 22-ounce bottles, and this was designed by Ken Beitelman, who, if I am still up to date with my information, lives above the brewery on the 3rd floor, and it can be seen in a lot of different competitions that happen in street art festivals and things. That he's still very active in the community. Just a couple early ads. I really like this one from around 1993. You can see a different logo that really only ever showed up, as far as I know, in just a couple ads, very short-lived, but kind of a fun ad. I'll give you a chance to read that one. You can see here they did use it a couple of different times around the same era. Here's the building as it looks today. Still has some fantastic architectural features, but as you can see, it's been stripped of a lot of what made it look as it did when it was first built. And then the interior. Some artwork that was either in the brewery or in collectors' collections. And in 1994, the brewery that had been in the back of this building was not proving to be sufficient, so they opened a much larger production facility at 123 West 3rd Street between Commercial and Broadway, and stayed there until 2014. And some of the early labels, these were designed by Dwayne Flatmo, well-known local artist and mural painter, sculptor, designer. Junkyard Wars, here he's at Burning Man, been involved in a lot of things over the years, found himself on television many times over the years. 1997 ad showing the new design, new logo. Wendy Pound left the company in 2000 to go back to family counseling and psychology work. The brewery has been involved in a number of different local events, primarily though the Kinetic Sculpture Race is something they're involved in every year. This is an interesting label that appears to be for the South Korean market. The hoppy beers, at least a couple of years ago, were very popular in South Korea, and Lost Coast was apparently one of the biggest selling beers. And so there are a few beers that they've actually made specifically for that market. There was some sort of a porter as well, vanilla porter, that was also made exclusively for the South Korean market. In 2014, new production facility was completed on Sunset near Broadway, tripling the capacity. They can produce well over 70,000, but that's what they did in 2019. And they have a 10-barrel brewing system for new beers, such as the Pilot and Graveyard system series, and limited batches, such as Pennywiser Ale. It was a collaborative release with the band Pennywise. I'll show you that in a moment. This is just like the Mad River. I think this might be conceptual artwork. I don't know if this was actually used anywhere, but it's very interesting. It was just something that I found online and thought it was interesting. And it's also the one and only time that I played with gradient shading. I tried it in other places and it just didn't work, but I like this orange and purple background. It worked well for this particular slide, but it can only be used once. Here's the Pennywiser label, a few different labels that have shown up primarily one-offs or seasonals, and then the brewery on the bottom. Eel River opened in 1995. They opened on the site of the former Clay Brown Redwood Mill in Fortuna. Margaret Fregon and Ted Vivitsons, I'm sure I said those wrong, brew pub and beer garden opened in 95. And 4 years later, they became the first certified organic brewery in the country. They use local recycled materials. They feed spent grain to cattle. Also pre-treat its wastewater and draws power from biomass. That's something that the Mad River in particular also has even been awarded for on a state level. And I forgot to mention that in their bio. In 2007, they needed a larger production facility, so they constructed a new brewery inside the former Palco Mill in Scotia. And they've sold their beers in all over the US, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil as of, this is actually from the original article, so it's possible they've expanded since then. These first two are some of the earliest labels. I don't have very good quality. If I blew these up even a little bit, they'd be next to unreadable and pixelated. And then kind of the second era labels. This is the beer garden at the brewery. This is actually one of the nicest places in Humboldt County to go have a beer outside. It's a really nice space. I think it's my favorite thing about this particular brewery. Some of the later labels, though not the most recent. You can see a redesign on their core line above, and then so they're one of their newest lines, the Hazy by Nature. There's 5 or 6 in this series, and these are the first few. So like a lot of the breweries, they're continuing to put out new products. I think for a long time, it was not even just here, but breweries all over, they kind of had a core product line and there wasn't a lot of experimentation. But in the last decade or two, especially, there's been a lot more experimentation by even established breweries. So that's great to see that our locals are keeping up. In 1996, Susan and Larry McCoy opened the Six Rivers Brewery in McKinleyville, and they used the original equipment from the Humboldt Brewing Company that had been in storage. This was the brewing equipment that was pulled out of the brewery in '92 when they expanded to their 50-barrel system, and it was stored ever since. And Carlos Sanchez, who is their head brewer, had also already worked on that as a brewer at Mad River and Humboldt. There's the McCoys. This is right as they were opening. They opened a Tide House, which is a brewery owned pub in the Healy Brothers building on 2nd Street in Eureka. I wanted a photo of this. I just didn't have time to get it or find the historic photo that I was looking for. But this was previously the Old Town Bar and Grill. Siren Song Tavern and Blue Ox Boutique currently occupy the space now. And the Old Town Bar and Grill is another place that all kinds of amazing musicians played, and that would be worth researching. Some of the original labels from the Six Rivers first attempts at bottling. I shouldn't say attempts, the first time they bottled. The Tide House operated until 2004, and they apparently it closed as part of the deal when they sold it to Meredith Mayer, Talia Natson, and Kurt. Actually, this is blocking my Povik. I've actually got stuff blocking my screen right here. Some of the early ads after the sale happened. The Weatherman Wheat label that you see in the bottom right apparently was kind of gone for a long time, and they've just recently brought that back. Some of their core line. And these seem to be seasonals or one-offs. And upon the departure of Povik in 2008, the brewery became the second in California to be owned exclusively by women. And the brew pub is located in the 1930s Pete's Bella Vista restaurant building with one of the better views in the county of any restaurant, looking out onto the Hammond Trail and the Arcata Bottoms. 2002, Whale Gulch opened. This brewery is actually just over the Mendocino line, but all of its beer was sold in Humboldt County. Jack Glick had been a home brewer and kind of actually operating an informal tasting room for a couple of years before he actually got his license and went through the process of having certified labels. And he had to transfer shipments from Whitethorn because large trucks were not able to go on the road to his brewery, as I'll show in a moment. And that time and expense was the primary reason that he said that his brewery was not able to continue beyond 2008. It's Usel Road in northern Mendocino County. And this is actually, from some of the photos I saw, this might actually some of the better sections of road. That you can see why large trucks wouldn't necessarily be able to transverse that area and the rest of their labels. Redwood Curtain Brewing Company opened in 2010 on South G Street in Arcata in the Bayview Industrial Center east of the Arcata Marsh. Drake and Amanda Moldberg are the owners of this brewery that maintain at least 3 strains of yeast. And it gives them an enormous variety of flavor combinations, and they make English, Belgian, German, and American styles, as well as barrel-aged and sours. They call them Funky Notions. And they've made well over 100 beers to date. I would be surprised if it's not closer to 200. This is the Arcata Tap Room. They are talking at some point about doing a bottling line, and I think this is a variation on one of their first labels. In 2018, they opened a tap room in Myrtletown in Eureka in the former Enrico's Wine Palace, featuring art by Mad Beard. This is right down the street from my house, and I'm very happy that this tap room is here. It's a great addition to this part of Eureka. Here's some information, advertising from the original owner of that, or occupier of that space, Enrico's. I went to school at Lafayette in the early 80s, and I used to go into this place all the time, and I'm really glad that it's somewhere I can go again, even if it looks a bit different. Humboldt Regeneration Brewery and Farm opened in 2012. Jason Pressey opened this brewery in McKinleyville, and it was recognized 3 years later by the California Craft Beers Association as being the first California brewery since Prohibition to brew a 100% house-grown and malted beer, basically meaning that from beginning to end, every step of the process, more or less, was done in-house. So congratulations to Jacob, and his future plans include a farm estate brewery where everything is done on site. Some of this is a little bit beyond my knowledge, but Jacob is also doing all of his own farming, obviously, to have been able to accomplish that, but he's using bio-intensive crop rotation, micro remediation, no-till soil management, so trying to keep his footprint as small as possible. He runs out of the storage unit, and so he has to maximize the space. So he has his brewing equipment on wheels, and he's able to roll it in and out. And it's a really fantastic place to be able to go speak to somebody directly, somebody that's actually made the beer, grew all the ingredients, and Jacob's a very friendly and knowledgeable person. In 2020, he released a project he'd been working on for over 8 years, a barrel-aged malt vinegar. And I helped him do a little research on vinegar makers in Humboldt County, and we're both fairly sure that he's the first malt vinegar maker ever in the county. So this colorful line of beers. Jacob also has produced well over 200 beers over the last couple of years as well. The Booth Brewing Company opened in 2017 in the former Lost Coast Brewery building, 123 West 3rd Street. They were the first Asian brewery to open a production facility in the United States. They had started by opening bars in Seoul where they're featuring their beer, and as demand grew, they looked for somewhere on the West Coast where the raw ingredients were more readily available, and it also made more sense to ship the finished product than the raw ingredients. They had initially planned to ship more or less everything to South Korea, but they became very popular very quickly. And so during those first couple of years, they started distributing to a number of other counties in California. And several of their labels featured local or regional references. There's a reference to the Dead Reckoning Tavern. There was the Eureka Soul Hop Ale series, and there was a red ale that was produced for the Campfire Relief Fund a couple of years ago when Sierra Nevada started that program. Excuse me. You can see some of the imagery. They didn't have a tap room, something they were talking about trying to open, but they did open up on occasion for events. And I actually really liked the setup with the low lighting and the being right in the middle of the brewing equipment. It was actually kind of a neat place to go have a couple of beers. And they also involved themselves in some of the local events, such as the Eureka Beer Run, happened in 2019. And just a few of their labels. I can see that I'm getting way over on time here, so I'll try to wrap this up quickly. Unfortunately, the booth ceased operations in 2020. They were making fantastic beer, so it's really sad to see them go. And I'm sorry to anybody that lost their jobs. It was also, I believe, a loss to Eureka as far as becoming more of a beer town. I think when you have several breweries and tap rooms, people start staying the night. And so I was looking forward to seeing more of these breweries opening. So I hope that's just not a sign. It took a long time for a second brewery to open. So I'm looking forward to hopefully somebody else taking that space. Apparently they did a lot of ADA improvements and all kinds of stuff. So that brewery is sitting there ready to go. However, out of that, this is an entirely local, but Doke beer was launched in 2020 by Youngwon Lee, who had been the manager at the booth in Eureka, and one of his brewers. And so the beer is actually being produced in various breweries in the Bay Area, but the recipes are locally made. So it's sort of got that local connection, and they're making some interesting beer combinations, including this kimchi sour and tart plum porter, among other interesting. There was a bamboo pilsner. In 2018, Julie Peacock and Josh Monchko, opened the Jippo Ale Mill in Shelter Cove. They are primarily doing lagers and ales with some barrel aging, and their brewery sits right on the edge of the airfield and a golf course, and you can see the ocean. So a really nice place to have a beer, and also just nice to see a brewery in the more remote regions of our county. Named in honor of Jippo loggers, independent logging operations that compete with the established local companies and corporate giants. And here is a definition that I found on Jippo's website. Couple of their growlers in their brewery. And finally, Powers Creek Brewery opened in 2019 in the Blue Lake Casino, and it was opened under brewmaster Dylan Schatz, the longtime head brewer at Mad River that we discussed earlier. And they feature a 1-barrel brew house and 2-barrel jacketed fermenter. And they plan to have a dedicated beer garden at some point. Obviously, wasn't the ideal moment in history to open a beer, but they managed to be able to be open a number of days. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with this brewery in the future. And that brings us to the end of the breweries. I do want to just mention one other thing, and that is that the way that this, I've mentioned this a little bit, but the way that this presentation will expand is either if more newspapers are digitized or if people that see this presentation can share what they have as well. So I'm going to show you a quick list of some of the things I'm really looking for, and I'm really hoping that that scans or photographs or copies could be sent to the Humboldt County Historical Society. And this is a good repository, even if I'm not involved at any point, so it can continue to go there. So if you're seeing this years from now, still continue to feed that file, please. I'd love to talk to Mario Collado or Robert Smith. I have never been able to get a hold of either one of those guys, and it would be interesting. I'd love some interior photos of the Humboldt Brewing Company that Mario might be able to provide, and just for stories of how they started and why they chose where they chose. Information regarding early brewers, I put all of those names in boldface so that hopefully people will say, hey, that's my family, and send me information about them. Photos would be awesome too. Humboldt Brewing and Humboldt Mullen Brewing Company merchandise photos. I basically showed you everything that I have. So if you have something or better quality than what I have, I would greatly appreciate that. Again, early brewery photos, they're very hard to find, but they can illuminate so much, giving us an idea of size and you know, what kind of equipment they were using and such. Bottle and can labels, I have some. I have some that have very good quality and a lot that are very poor quality. So any era would be great. Any of the modern breweries, I'd like to ultimately have it all chronicled and archived, as well as artwork and advertising. International Beer Garden posters and performance history. If you know somebody that performed there, I want to know. Interior shots of the Humboldt Brewery again. And I haven't been able to find a good copy of the early Six Rivers logo brewery. I showed it, the first slide of that black and white logo. I know that it's full color on logo pint glasses and might exist elsewhere. So I'd love a copy of that. And if you're able to help me out with any of that, you can contact the Humboldt County Historical Society. I know everyone down there, so any information you send will make its way back to me. And I'm sorry that we've gone far longer than I had anticipated, but I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If there's any other questions, I am here for as long as you need me to be. All right, Lauren.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat. Isn't there also a t-shirt that you guys are selling at the Historical Society?
Yes. Can you see me? Because I'm on some screen that...
Go ahead and close the share screen, and then you'll pop up to the full size again.
Oh, okay, I see.
There you go. Yeah.
So yeah, this is the Humboldt Malt and Brewing Company shirt. This is, the front says Humboldt Beer with the Humboldt County Historical Society. And then on the back, it's a combination of some of the letterheads I showed you. So these are available at the Historical Society or at Humboldt Beer Works, homebrew supply store. Kenneth Berry has been kind enough to sell those for us as well. So either one. And if we run out, we can make a list and do a third run if necessary. So whatever size you need should be available at some point or another.
And yeah, looks like there aren't any other questions. So thank you for joining us, everyone. This will be recorded and put on YouTube probably Tuesday. So it'll be available there. If you're here, you're already signed up for future presentations. So next month we'll be on murals and other public art pieces in Eureka. So that should be fun. And yeah, if you have any questions or you have any of the information that Michael's looking for, you have my email. So if you have something, you can always email me and I can pass it on to him. So on that note, I will go ahead and let everybody go for the weekend. Thank you again, Michael, for this very informative presentation. I didn't realize there was such a history here. Yeah, and everybody have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.